afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at Personal Democracy Forum. This is an amazing event that attracts people from all over the world to talk about important issues related to democracy and the internet and technology. And now that I've had a chance to become an elected official, we're trying to make sure that we bring government to the people. With a background in technology, I'm hoping to leverage technology as much as possible to do so. But at the end of the day, the most 1.0, the best way we can make government accessible is by bringing government to the people. So what better way than to bring government to Personal Democracy Forum, to you, to the international community, to see how we can do things. You can tweet me at Ben Kalos, and I'm joined here today by our Manhattan Borough President, Gail Brewer, and you can tweet her at Gail A. Brewer. And she is actually of cult status. She is the author, and she got it passed, the most progressive open data law in the country. She's also a sponsor. I've introduced so many bills this session at her request. She was the original governmental operations chair, and with it has done so much to make our government transparent. And I do my best to follow her in her footsteps. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our Manhattan Borough President, Gail Brewer.
Thank you very much, Councilmember. And it is definitely a pleasure to work with you. I think this is, we've done a couple of events together, but this is the first solely real tech event, and this is very exciting. So I think we'll have slightly different ways of coming to you regarding some of the technology initiatives that we're working on, but they're both complementary. And so I just want to talk about a couple of things that we've been working on and really hope this is a discussion. So I was in the City Council for 12 years. I was chair of technology for 8 years, and then on government relations as government operations as the chair. And 10 years ago in tech time is many decades ago. So we started out in the technology committee. One of the things we looked at was broadband, just to give you a sense of how things have progressed, changed, but still stay the same. And what was most enlightening to me was to go to all 5 boroughs in the mid-2000s and talk to people about digital divide and broadband. And what you learned, no surprise to you, was that the libraries and schools were primarily the only places with connectivity, and even Starbucks didn't have it at that time. There were a lot of small businesses in Sunset Park and throughout Brooklyn in particular that either had really slow, or Verizon hadn't even figured out how to keep their copper out of underwater when it rained in Sunset Park. So it was a whole different world. People were actually gathered around libraries all around the city with chairs on the weekends trying to get some kind of connectivity near a library. At first we thought they were drug dealers. We didn't know what was coming out of the bushes. I'm not making this up. So that was the discussion of broadband. It was a huge committee. It was a law that was passed. People came from Verizon and community to go to all 5 boroughs to learn about the challenges of having what I would consider free access. Even in the parks it was an issue. There was a tiny bit of free access in the parks, and I remember the Parks Commissioner at the time when we mentioned hotspots, he turned bright red, having no idea what a hotspot was. So those were some of the challenges that we had. We also then, as Ben indicated, passed the open data law, which was, and that probably still is, the most progressive open data legal policy adopted by a municipality, and it has a lot of challenges still, but I'll bring you up to date on that in a minute. And I think what we're working on now in the Borough President's office, the Borough President works on land use issues. We work on appointments to all the community boards and many, many other appointments. We work on obviously allocating budget, and obviously we also work on whatever other school-related, mental health-related, arts-related, other topics that are of importance to the borough. But in terms of the community boards, there are 12 in Manhattan, and we're very, very serious about making them more computer savvy. I know that we have some members here who are on the community boards, the people in the audience, but we are going to be able, thanks to one of our deputy borough presidents, to have very sophisticated, well-trained CUNY students at every community board to work on technology. And in addition, you'll see soon we'll be able to do a lot more with the community boards. The community boards are swamped with data. They have large developers coming to them every single week with a new project. And they're not able to say, okay, we have X number of families, X number of seniors, X number of young people, and then many other. We have this and that we need for our neighborhood, because they don't have the data, not to mention it match. So that's that whole notion of how do you prepare community boards for that kind of onsite from the developers is what we're focused on. And I think we'll be able to satisfy their needs come September. We'll announce that in the near future. So the fact of the matter is, how do you take, in my opinion, all of this possible data and make it open? And so I think when I introduced the bill, it was hard to comprehend that people would would know and be able to answer how many potholes have been filled in the last 6 months, or what are the raw feeds of all traffic accidents in the city. And what came together to help pass the bill was the New York City Transparency Working Group. And it was the first time, to be honest with you, and I feel very proud about this, that the good government groups, NYPIRG, League of Women Voters, Common Cause, those groups that have been working on improving government transparency, but without the technology input. They've been doing that for centuries, probably 100 years. The Women's City Club has been around for 100 years. But they had never, until I introduced them to technology folks who also were looking at transparency, never worked together. So the groups of Transparency Open Plans, folks from, some of you may know John Keeney from reInvent Albany, lots of groups like that who do mapping and who understand data came together. And their input, along with some folks, academics from NYU and some of the other universities, really helped push the open data law, and they continue to do the monitoring and would love to see it obviously happen on the statewide level. So this New York City Transparency Working Group is something that is a model for anybody trying to get something done in government, because they were, thanks to the Bloomberg administration, Carol Post, who was commissioner at the time at DoIT, it really was a working group of government and the nonprofit sector to pass this bill. We met in coffee shops, we met in offices, we met all around the city to try to get this bill passed. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy, because the notion that agencies would make their data available was a challenge. I should add that very currently, a couple of days ago, we met with New York Police Department. And if you could think of the two sets that people want most, DOE, Department of Education, NYPD, and then you could throw in the Board of Elections. Yes, Art Chang has done a great job on that. But the fact of the matter is PD and DOE are the #1 requests. I'm sure people want crash data, but that often comes not just DOT, also NYPD. NYPD, under this new administration, is working with us, has now decided that transparency is a good thing. I have to give them a lot of credit. And so they are going to be feeding some of this information into the open data law. That's a huge breakthrough in terms of open data. So the whole challenge of the open data law, and we just were joined by the very great John Keeney, was to find out how do you deal with the timeline for data release, what are the requirements for public input, and the annual reporting on agency compliance with data release. This is all the minutia of passage of a bill, and then how do you actually monitor it as time goes on. We have a long way until all city data is unlocked, but we've had robust data sets of citywide 311 reports, property tax info from Pluto, which is from the City Planning Commission, and I think a lot of data sets on motor vehicle collisions, which is another unfortunate factor in our lives, but something that we want to know how it is, what the data is. We obviously had, before the open data law, we had several big apps which the Bloomberg administration initiated, and they used the data even before the open data was available. That data was used for the big apps. I must admit, and this is just Gail Brewer talking, when I love the big apps, I love going, but it was often how many good restaurants you could find, or the one that made me nuts was how do you get a parking space. I could get my parking space without an app. I know how to fight, I'm a New Yorker. I did not need an app for that. I do need an app to know the young people who are graduating and what the status is of job placement and things that actually have to do with DOEs, real human beings and how they survive in our city, but the parking spaces was it good for a big app, but not for me. So now that as borough president, we're really going to focus, as I indicated, with all this data on community boards. And let me give you some examples of how it could be useful and how I think the open data needs to be improved. Just the other day, we were at a conference with a group of parks advocates, people who want to take the waterfront and make it more park friendly, make it more user friendly, access to the waterfront, all these great things that go on when you have a good waterfront policy. I know that the city does have a capital project dashboard because I've seen it. I can't tell you because on city computers, you're going to laugh, it's hard to access because no matter what browser you use, it doesn't seem to work, and you have to call somebody from the IT office to get the browser fixed so that you can use the dashboard. That's not a really accessible project list. So, and I don't think the capital projects list is on the open data portal. I mean, I could spend more time figuring all that out. But the point of the matter is, it's not easy to find. It's not something that the public knows anything about. And the Parks Department, to their credit, particularly under the new commissioner, wants to open up the data on their 400 active capital park sites. Now, if you want to see people interested in their community talk about parks, people want to know about playgrounds, they want to know about sand lots, they want to know about access to the waterfront, they want to know if that ballpark is going to be fixed, if it's going to be drained, if it's going to be, God help us, natural grass, or if it's going to have field turf. I could give you a lot of information about parks. I know parks, and I know capital projects in parks. But I can't tell you that I can tell you, because I have millions of dollars personally allocated by me and the city council that I know is not on any capital project list. So that is an example, even though there is a dashboard, it's definitely not on the portal, and I don't even think it's accessible from a city computer. I just say all of this because of the work that has to get done, but the possibilities are endless. To have all 400 New York City capital projects from the Parks Department, having that data posted with timelines and updates real time on a website, people would be really pleased to have that. You could move that towards the Department of Design and Construction. You could move that towards other agencies. Some of it's up. Easy to access, no. And real time, no. And those are the ways that the community boards and the public would really feel like something was done for them. And that's what my goal is when you have a really good open data policy that's transparent. Obviously, you include mapping, you include visualization tools, you can use that to have specific 311 statistics that can roll into it where appropriate. So those are the ways in which we want the open data law to use. Now I just want to go through some of the other big issues, and I'm dying to get your input in that we've been working on for a very long time, because they're all related to how do we make government information transparent. That's why I started looking at these issues 20 years ago, building funny little kiosks, and you see all the crazy things we used to do before the internet existed and before some of you were born, probably. But the fact of the matter is, always my goal has been how do you use technology to open up public information, which is your information. So some of the issues we're looking at is Do It Now has an upcoming payphone redesign, which will incorporate Wi-Fi at every existing payphone location. It also hopefully will keep some payphones. Not everybody has a phone that is attached to them in some way, but not everybody has a cell phone, and there are emergencies. Your phone has run out of, doesn't have a charger, you have an emergency. I believe in payphones. But it's a very complicated issue. You'll find that the community members feel there are too many payphones just on a non-technology issue. They feel like there's too much advertising. You'll also find that Wi-Fi sounds good to some people, but others have come up with other ideas. They want to have health data. They want to have health data attached to a payphone, which is an interesting concept. They also want to have what I call chemical sensors. There's a lot of push to know what is the carbon monoxide in this area. There's a lot of push to know into the new issue where a lot of buildings are switching, as you might know, from oil to natural gas. People are nervous about radon. all of these kinds of issues could be part of a payphone redesign. Again, ideas from you and ideas from the public are welcome. Second, I was the one that started the notion of .nyc, and sometimes you say, be careful what you wish for. So I started it, had a hearing in technology some 10 years ago on .nyc, because I'd heard that Berlin and Paris were having .Berlin and .Paris. I said, we're not going to be left behind. So we did some research, and we pushed the city, and now, many years later, the Bloomberg administration applied to the national organization called ICANN. I can't remember what it stands for, but International Domain something or other. And the city of New York has been now allocated .nyc with a company that is the middleman between the city of New York and the people and the organizations and the companies and the nonprofits. And I could go on and on about .nyc. I thought it would be for the pizza store on the corner, but now I'm afraid it might be for everybody, etc. So the whole issue of .nyc is very much on the city's mind. There were 2 people who testified at the hearing, just so you know, when the actual contract was to be let, me and Tom Lowenfeld. That is not a really popular hearing, right? 2 people, that was it. So I think it could have been done in a more transparent fashion. But .nyc is happening. I think also we need to look at procurement policies, talking about procurement. Procurement policies acting as barriers to entry for tech startups who could provide services to government. Procurement is slow. Technology is not. Sometimes by the time you get something procured for technology, the technology has changed. And again, that's something that every procurement officer, the mayor's office of contracts, wrestles with, and I think they'd love to have your input. I'm going to also just mention the issue of schools. Having had, I don't know how many hearings on this topic, we have about 1,400 school buildings, we have over 1 million pupils, we have many school buildings with lots of schools. The computer equipment lasts about 5 years. Training is needed. The pipes coming into the schools are still small and slow, and so the young people are still not getting the same kind of training in technology and availability that you would get in a private school. I won't get into charters versus public schools, another whole discussion, but we really need some help or thought processes in terms of the schools in the city of New York and how we either change the procurement, allow people to have much faster access, and certainly there's a big discussion with the Office of Management and Budget. You should know, because the schools are only allowed any kind of networked equipment that lasts a certain time period, and if it's not networked, lots of capital funding cannot purchase it. So they end up with carts of laptops and not necessarily iPads or standalones that people can take home. A long story. If you don't have children in the public schools, you may not know this, but you should know that your help is needed. Another topic, of course, is just the issue of the future of net neutrality. It's been in the papers a lot, but we'd love to hear some more discussion about that. We learned today that there's going to be in New York City the Public Service Commission, which is a state agency, in the middle of this month is going to have a Comcast Time Warner merger hearing, and we hope that everybody testifies. I have a lot of concerns about this merger. I've met with the Time Warner people, I've met with the Comcast people. One of my concerns, I go way back to the very first cable hearing when Time Warner and Comcast came to the city of New York, and not Comcast, Cablevision and Time Warner were in the city of New York, and we had many discussions about not cherry picking, where the 2 companies would do their business, how they couldn't leave out certain neighborhoods, et cetera, and how they would support public access channels, and how they would support libraries and schools and the city of New York. This particular deal, if it goes through, does not have to have any city input because it's going to be a stock only and no cash. And so there'll be no franchise hearing, no franchise hearing until 2018, I believe, or 2017, when the cable contract generally is up. So whatever happens, that will be a deal of mega proportions and very little input except for this one, in my opinion, measly hearing. Another topic, of course, is just wireless in the city of New York. I find increasingly, we learned this in the broadband hearing, it hasn't changed. New Yorkers don't have a lot of, families don't have a lot of money. A lot of low-income students and families and seniors are not able to pay the 50 or 30 or whatever deal carriers, and I say deal in quotes, give families. And lots of times people pay for connectivity for a carrier for a while. We learned at the hearings, when the food and the health care and other bills come due, the one that doesn't get paid is the one that you're paying for your connectivity, whatever carrier. And so you end up with no internet and you end up trying to have free wireless. That's what families do. And so I will tell you that we need, in my opinion, I don't know that we're ever going to have municipal Wi-Fi. I've had this conversation. I know what happened in Philadelphia and San Francisco and other cities where they tried and it wasn't possible. But we'd love to have a discussion about generally what is the future of more opportunities for cutting the digital divide, if you want to call it that. Free wireless, hotspots, who's going to do it? Right now, some of the business improvement districts do it. Obviously, there's a philanthropist who's doing a large track, Frederick Douglass in Harlem. There are 5 commercial areas that Economic Development Corporation is doing. And once you do them, you still have to train small businesses and the families about how to use it. You can have a whole discussion in the South Bronx where we had some free Wi-Fi and the small stores never used it because nobody sat down with them to explain how they could use it. Because even though it was there, they didn't actually have a computer in the little store. They didn't know how to build a website and they didn't really use it. So the whole issue of discussing it, having it, teaching it, training it, and so on is another topic. And then just finally, this, I know this isn't directly related, but how do we use our streetscape in a different kind of way? We have a task force. This is a little stretch on the issue of technology, but it is of interest to me, which is electric vehicles, electric carts, Fresh Direct making all that noise with their refrigeration on the streets, you name it. There are so many trucks that could plug into something, so you wouldn't sound like you're in a helicopter pad every time you pass a truck or a electric vehicle or something. If you want to make people happy, you figure out a way that that is a quieter experience. I've never ordered from Fresh Direct, but I bet half of you have. And then you complain about the truck while you're ordering. That was quite a call. I said to the woman, do you ever order? Oh, I order every day. And you're complaining about the truck down the street. Great. So that whole issue of how do you quiet our city? And I see Art Chang sitting over there, so I can't forget the great work that he's done on the issue of trying to get transparency into the voting process. That's a huge challenge. I'm sure he'll add his voice to it, whether it's apps or trying to figure out a voting process that's more transparent and that uses technology in a way that assists all of us. It seems to be some of it has to go to Albany, some of it is local, all of it is a challenge. So I'm here with Will Colgrove. I look forward to hearing from you after we've heard from the council member, and these are my favorite topics. Thank you very much.
That was at Gail A. Brewer on Twitter, so please share your thoughts and opinions with her over the Twitter sphere as well as in here. Also wanted to share again, I'm at Ben Kalos, and in the back of the room we have a video camera rolling. Everything that's happening in this room will be put online for those who couldn't make it here to Personal Democracy Forum. That's what transparency means. So if you're not comfortable being filmed and set out over the internet, then please feel free to just send your feedback to us through other methods. So I just want to tell you a little bit about my personal journey. I became a lawyer. I went to SUNY Buffalo Law School, and I graduated, became a lawyer, and the first thing I found out was that the law wasn't free. I had to pay for Westlaw or LexisNexis, so back in '06, the first thing I did is I created wikilaw.org because I was going to put all the law online for free, and then I found out that really wasn't possible at the time. So I ended up merging my project with Jurispedia and moving on because I thought maybe I could do something in the electoral process. So a guy named Larry Lessig had a similar conclusion. And the first thing I found out was in New York State we had dropped 2 million out of our 12 million registered voters. And heading into the 2008 election, I built a site called votersearch.org so that people could verify their voter registration. It was a new concept at the time. New York State ended up doing it. It became something that we started doing nationally. We did it with the DNC and elsewhere. But it was incredibly important, and it was one of these things that took like 100 lines of code. I taught myself MySQL, PHP, and started to transition away from law into programming, and it's had an impact. And for all of you watching or in the room, please make sure you verify your voter registration, because it is not permanent. It is not immutable. It's not like selective service. You have to keep doing it every time you move, and your right to vote is paramount, because otherwise democracy really doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the voters. And I'll tell you that in my own election, out of the 160+ thousand people who live in my district, only 7,000 people determined the vote, which means a very small group of people called super primes are doing that. And then in New York City, where we have 48 Democrats and 3 Republicans, you need to be registered with one of the 2 parties in order to vote in primaries, which are essentially the only elections that we really have. So that's food for thought. And just one key thing while I have Art Chang here, from the chair of the Voter Assistance Commission and part of the New York City Campaign Finance Board, we have public finance in New York. Anyone who isn't from New York, you need public finance. I was able to run an election. I got 6-to-1 matching, and I was able to take all of my money from my residents and calling everyone I've ever met and asking for $10 or $100. And I was able to say no to special interests and lobbyists and people like that, because I didn't need their money, and I still don't. And that's changed government. Now in 2009, I decided I'd try to do things from within the system. So the electoral route didn't quite work, so maybe if I was in government I could do something. So I was the chief of staff in the assembly, and I found out that no one actually knew how the elected officials were voting. So I realized that that was a constant source of frustration for my assembly member, Jonathan Bing. And so when I left, I asked him permission, and we foiled all of the voting records in Albany. And just at that time, Andrew Hoffman was the CIO at the Senate, along with Noel Hidalgo, who was his chief innovation person. Close enough. And so at the same time, we all ended up getting the legislation online. And for the first time, and this is 2009, mind you, you could actually see online how your elected officials were voting. So then I got to run in 2013, and we actually launched an open platform where we crowdsourced our platform, and 100 ideas came from me, but 33 came from the community, which was kind of fun because we were able to engage our electorate. But quite honestly, I feel like we should have had more engagement, and that's one of the challenges I bring to you. How do we get more engagement? And so we've posted all of our legislation online now. So this is a Drupal site. It's free and open source. It's a FDRO GPL2 license, and everything here is Creative Commons or non-copyright at all. But you can actually go online, see summaries of my bills, and you can even comment on the bills on my site, which is also a feature that the New York State Senate has had for a while, but somehow the New York City Council still are working on it. Another piece is we posted both my platform and we've posted our legislation on GitHub. This is just trying to reach out to the software and civic hacker community. This is something that Clay Shirky, who actually lectures here at this university, said would happen one day. He said that last year, so I'm not sure how often it happens that somebody lectures about something in a TED Talk and then it happens within the week, or at least happens a week before they lecture about it. But so all of our legislation is online for you. How many of you use GitHub? So a sizable number. So on my Drupal site, because of the state of Drupal 6 modules with regards to wikis and it not being quite something inherent, it's not as easy, but if you really want to just go click on the legislation and start changing the code, and we're not talking about software code, we're talking about the legal code that will operate our government, you can actually go in there and treat it like a code repository. So we posted it on GitHub, and we've also partnered with OpenGov Foundation out of DC to post it on Madison, which is their new framework for allowing people to comment on legislation. And I challenge people here to, specifically David Moore from Participatory Politics Foundation, to please put it on Councilmatic. And Then we've also introduced 7 bills, and Nancy Scola has covered almost all of them and noticed that there was a raft of legislation. We have all of it in front in paper form. We also have it available for you on those online sites. And what we were hoping to do is do something a little bit different in that we're bringing government to you. So we were hoping to tap into your collective minds. And I'll be honest, we weren't expecting quite the turnout that we got today. But we'd really love, as part of the second half of this, to really hear from you. So we'll be giving you the mic and asking you to tell us what you think about some of these. And in particular, I just want to take some time to go over the bills. We have rules reform. That actually already passed. Worked very closely with the Transparency Working Group community around making sure that our legislation is online and has an open API. It's really, really close. The language that we put in says a third, that people should be able to access our legislation through a third party, so we're really happy about that, and we'll work within the system to make sure that that happens, but I need external pressure from you, and I'm actually working with a team of other cities, because in government, and this is really, really sad, vendors tell government how to spend its money. So government might say, we want X. We want to make sure that we provide wireless for the entire city. And the vendor will come back and say no, but what we will do is we'll charge you the same price as giving the entire city Wi-Fi, and we'll only do it for this small area, and that won't work very well. And so what we're trying to do is be disruptive to the model and change things around and get together as communities and say, no, we're done with that. We're done paying somebody. We're paying $67 million for the Microsoft ELA. So Microsoft built Microsoft Office, built Word. It no longer costs money to maintain the version of Word that we're all using and whatnot, and they're charging us over and over and over and over and over again for the same code. And for those of us from the free and open source community, you get code. The code isn't something that you pay money for other than to have somebody configure it. You do pay for somebody to maintain it, and when you want additional features, that happens, those features are added, and then they get released to the rest of the community. So that is a very different model, and that's what we're hoping to see. So we have rules reform in the city council. It's something we fought for in Albany for years, but I'm glad to say we have it now, and so I'm proud of that. We're doing a lot of government transparency. Andrew Shea said, why don't we have POIA, which is public equals online. So I took a look at the federal POIA bill. I didn't like it, so we just redrafted it ourselves and worked with, again, the transparency community around it. And I think this is another change. Lobbyists really aren't drafting legislation. We are giving a chance for the community to start drafting it, and then once it's even drafted, widening the scope so others can help. So POIA means public, means online. So community boards deal with huge documents that get sent to them. ULURP applications, which is Uniform Land Use Review Process. So somebody's going to block out your son, put up a luxury high-rise, and the way you find out about it is because they put up a sign on the wall, they have a community board hearing, and if you want to see what the plans actually are, you have to show up at the community board during business hours to see the plans, and you have a right to inspect it. So that does away with this inspection concept that it's public because it's sitting in a drawer somewhere at Alpha Centauri, and as a result they can now demolish planet Earth, for those who are Hitchhikers fans, but make sure that it's actually online. We have a city record. Has anyone ever read the city record? Okay, so in New York City, the way we tell people about things is we have the city record. The city record gets distributed to elected officials and municipal government agencies, and that's public notice. And if you want to know what's in the city record, you can stop by a government office during business hours to inspect it, or you can subscribe and pay money for it. So we're trying to take the city record online that's already there, make it open, create a searchable API, an open API, and get rid of the pay publishing requirements so we can save a couple of trees. And last but not least is electronic notices. So when government tries to do things, whether it's the city council or borough presidents, community boards, or agencies that are doing buildings, we have different bizarre publishing requirements. Sometimes it goes in a newspaper, sometimes it goes in the city record, sometimes it gets taped up on a lamppost, sometimes it gets put on a cork board, but in all cases, people don't find out. The people who do care about it are called special interests, and they pay lobbyists, and the lobbyists get paid a lot of money to find out. So the idea behind electronic notices is that it's there, it's on a centralized portal, and app developers and civic hackers, like people in this room, hopefully Beta NYC, can help us develop an app, or even commercial developers can develop an app so that people can find out about what's going on, when a bar is applying for a license on their block, when somebody's going to block out their sunlight, when the city council is hearing something that matters to them. So that's e-notices. We're also doing something on mapping transparency. We have this great site, New York City, maps.nyc.gov. I know that my colleague Richard Stallman would like it to no longer be JavaScript based, and I hear more and more people saying that they don't want to run non-free software on their computers, so we'll try to address that. But on OpenMap, there's this great GIS data, but you don't actually have an ability to use it. So what we're asking DoIT to do is to make sure that they put a link, a permalink to that data set so that people can use it. Additionally, we have GIS information out there. So there's lots of accidents. We are now releasing more crash information than ever. But if you've has anyone here ever been in a collision? So for those of you who've been in a collision, you see a collision report, and the collision report has a diagram of where you got in the accident. And it shows, and they usually draw pictures of the car or the other bicycle or the pedestrian or whatever it is, and they draw it, and then they take that information, which is analog and precise, or more precise than otherwise, and they give it to us in open data as a intersection. So sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not, but it's a lot more helpful to know that there were 30 accidents and all of them happened on the southwest corner in the left-hand turning lane, where there's a bike lane that intersects the left-hand lane, than, oh, it just happened at this intersection. So this bill does that, and also has other impacts because it would go to summons and other violations, and we'd be able to see things like, hey, why are people writing so many tickets in this specific neighborhood? And our administration has made a commitment to stop writing tickets as a form of raising revenue, specifically with small businesses in the outer boroughs. And so this is a way of actually measuring them in real time in terms of what's happening. Another bill that is really exciting is opening the law. So it only took 8 years. It's now 2014. I've gotten a chance to co-sponsor a bill with Councilmember Brad Lander, the Deputy Leader for Policy. And the goal here is when the law gets published, so currently we do something, I pass a law, and it has to do with all of you. So all of you are now bound by a new law, but you don't know what it is. So you want to find out what it is, so you can go to a Supreme Court library where they pay for a subscription, or you can pay for a subscription, a couple $100,000 a month, to LexisNexis or Westlaw, we call them Wexis. And way back when they were created, the whole concept was the way that government made information available is they put it in paper, they put it on a shelf, and they put it in a library, or they put it in a bookcase, or in a drawer in a basement, and that's how you got to it. But in this modern age, that's an outdated model, and there's no reason to lock things up behind Wexis. So, in fact, when I'm trying to draft laws, and I need to look at what the law is, we actually had the city council tell me I needed to buy a Wexis account so that I could access the law in order to draft new ones. Think about how backwards that is. So hopefully we can do this, and we can make the law open and online along with our legislation. And the last but not least is a bill that we're doing with Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer, which is FOIL transparency. And this is some coverage from the Gotham Gazette. This is something that the mayor wrote a report on for FOIL transparency, and the city of Oakland and others have this free and open source software created by Code for America that we can literally pay a city employee or even a volunteer civic hacker a couple of hours to configure, and then start allowing people to use the system to submit FOIL requests, respond to FOIL requests, and track FOIL requests. So we're going to have a hearing on that. One of the things we had hoped to do was actually have this as an official hearing, and then gavel in, gavel out, and start back up on June 9th. So on Monday at 1 o'clock at City Hall, we'd love for you to join us in testifying on the open FOIL. on the open law and city records online. For those of you who can't make it, because very few people can make it to City Hall between the hours of 9 and 5, we urge you to email in comments, or if I'd like to actually open it up to public comment now, if you want to talk about it or stand up here and either speak to it off the cuff, or if you have prepared remarks, we'd love to have you, and we'll video you, we'll cut it up, post it on YouTube, and then host it on our site and submit it to the official record. So that being said, I just wanted to thank you, and I have 3 years, 6 months, and 25 days in this position to try to do something disruptive and change the way government ultimately functions. And I need you to do it. I can't do it alone. I'm one person with Gail Brewer. That's 2 of us in this government who are trying to change the way it operates. But it won't work unless you step up to the plate. So accountability works both ways. You get to hold me accountable now because of all this transparency, but we get to hold you accountable, and we get to beg and plead with you to please step up to the plate. Please take back your government so that it truly belongs to you. So I just want to say thank you for joining us today, and without further ado, does anyone want to give public comment?
Any questions, more importantly, or any ideas? Questions? Question from a very special person in the back.
Thank you. Gail, you're so generous. Anyway, I'm a product of the Civic Tech Innovation here in New York City. And one frustration we had is my ears perk up when Gail mentioned procurement. And last year we attempted to participate as a small civic startup. And when we were going to the RFP, it said, oh, you need X million dollars of insurance. So for a small civic startup, that was not something that we can do. And one idea that I've been pushing for a while, I mean, in smaller circles, is perhaps we have another innovation like NYC Big Apps. And I'm thinking a lot of these agencies have big backlogs that don't require an RFP, that maybe like $50,000 or $10,000, like micro projects. Why not?
Backlogs, like what do you mean by backlogs?
IT backlogs of projects.
IT
backlog of projects that they want to do that are just too small for the RFP process. Perhaps they can expose it to the civic tech community, so people at Beta NYC or Big Apps perhaps, instead of creating yet another bathroom finder or something else, even with the big issues, can actually build something that is needed by the government. And then as another idea is, when that's done, the code, every civic innovation doesn't necessarily lead to a startup. Maybe if they build something that something is useful, they can put it in the New York City's GitHub account. And then people can keep innovating on that innovation that they did for the city. Just one idea.
Anyone can submit to Big Apps, you know. I mean,
Right.
anyone can use the city data and submit to Big Apps. That's, anyone who builds anything using the city data.
Yeah, but the idea is perhaps instead of people creating issues on their own, maybe if there are issues from the IT backlog of the city.
I think the issue, this is just from my 40 years in government, I think that the notion of a civic hackathon, what you're saying is interesting. I'm sure that the notion of sharing data is probably what gets them nervous. And once you figured out how to address it, then the question would become, if something is to implement it, then you can't probably go sole source, you still have to do an RFP. So, but I think it's a really good idea to work on. I mean, it's one of those, I always say you can buy, toilet paper or food and so on. You basically do it in a competitive situation, and there's rush on the fresh food, but there's no rush on the packaged food, there's no rush on the toilet paper for the jails and the hospitals and so on. But technology changes, and the whole procurement concept is just wrong for technology. And so your ideas are good ones. We can try. I don't think it's legislative as much as the Mayor's Office of Operations, the Mayor's Office of Procurement. Not to say these issues haven't been discussed endlessly.
So let me just give you an additional answer. So 2 bills I failed to mention are a free and open source software preference that we've introduced based on New Hampshire and Oklahoma laws. And with all due respect to both states, this is New York City, and we should not be following other states. We should be leading them. Additionally, with that, a complement for the free and open source software preference is requiring New York City to engage in civic commons. Right now, Code for America has the ownership over that project, but I thought a good way for our city to support the Civic Commons, which is, for those of you who don't know, whenever it was basically mentioned, anytime the government purchases software, it should be with a free and open source software license, and then that code base should be posted onto Civic Commons or a New York City GitHub, and then we should also be openly looking at free and open source projects being done by other cities, and then posting it to our own, and then vesting that agency with the responsibility of going to different agencies within governments and saying, hey look, there's this software package, we think it'll save you $1 million or $1 billion. With regard to the $10,000 projects, I can tell you that the City Council is trying to buy a piece of legislative software. And so I asked them to do an open API. They came back with an outrageous number for, this is why we can't do an open API. And everyone said, oh, it's too expensive. And I'm a software developer, so I was literally able to sit down with the decision maker in my body and show them what the Sunlight API Open States looks like. And they actually posted their code on GitHub. And I said to them, and I said, look, this is 84 lines, or maybe it was 124 lines of Python code that is running the Open States Open API. And I was able to say to them, I'm sorry, there is no way that 84 lines of code costs 6 figures or 7 figures. And what we're missing within it is if every single time you want a piece of software that a developer could build in a day, you have to go through an RFP process. And the sad part is nobody in their life ever got fired for hiring IBM or Microsoft. So to make it worth Microsoft's time or IBM or whomever or Lockheed Martin's time, they're going to create a much higher inflation than a civic team of hackers would, or software developers who want to give back. So we do need to change the procurement.
Art had a question.
I actually want to just address Joel's question, because it's a good one. I think there's to just take your comments to the next step, I think there's a lot of pent-up frustration among folks who have the skill sets to be able to take
Everybody
action.
here, Art? Everybody here? We got to talk about Art.
Art, you can grab the mic.
There's a huge amount of frustration that I perceived among civic technologists who have the skill sets to be able to take action, but who don't find responsive partners on the part of government, and where issues like procurement rules actually stand as an impediment to taking action. And so at the Campaign Finance Board, we thought about this a lot, because we are one of the things that, I'm one of the 4 members of the Campaign Finance Board. I chair the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee.
He's a chair.
And also in my private life, I run a hybrid incubator and investment company called Green Point Partners that creates software startups. And we wanted to take a very simple idea, which is to look at the voter guide for the city, which if you're a city voter, you receive every year in paper format. It is dozens of pages thick. It is a tremendous misuse of trees and delivery vehicles.
Yeah, but all voters are over 60 or 70, so.
That's
yeah.
right. But it's also required by law. But we took this observation, taking this archaic tool and actually making it something that was friendly for voters. And then we took it a step further, which is to say, well, if we're providing browse for voters, shouldn't we also be providing something to make it easier for candidates to run for office and to comply with some of the arcane rules around contributions? And so what we did was we said, well, we're not going to get a budget for this. We're not going to be able to procure this the standard way. So let's think a little bit out of the box about how you can do something. The Wagner School put together a civic hackathon in 2011. And we took this concept to the civic hackathon and presented it as an idea that essentially if voting is your checkout for democracy and technology is becoming the interface between people and government, shouldn't there be an Amazon.com-like functionality for this election process? And we found, we were among 12 groups that presented. And afterwards, about half the developers in the room wanted to come work on this project. And that was a sign that we're on the right path to something pretty cool. A small team of hackers then created a prototype whose name I'm just embarrassingly blanking out. But it stood up in the 2012 elections and was kind of an example for what could be done by demonstrating in a view form a prototype for something that we could then turn into something that the Campaign Finance Board itself could support, and that the management and leadership inside the Campaign Finance Board staff would also support. And from that, we took the prototype around to actually technology companies here in New York City and organized a public-private partnership. We organized Pivotal Labs on the software side, Method on the branding and UX and UI side, and my firm, Tipping Point Partners, and our software development firm, Orchard, to do product development and product leadership. And in a period of 6 months, we created NYC Votes, which launched in 2013 as a way for voters to find out all the different, you browse and shop for voting, but also a compliant credit card processing tool for candidates. And we took it in a very quiet launch in 2013, and it met all of its objectives, and it will be expanded upon going forward. Now, the interesting thing, and this is also another interesting comment that's good for both of you, is that the intent of this private group that was creating this was to take the software and gift it to the city. The city has no gifting method for receiving intellectual property. And as a result, what we got in response was the city's form software license agreement that would allow us to license the software to the city, requiring the group, which got paid nothing to do this, to accept all unlimited liability for errors and omissions, any intellectual property violations, and then to provide corrections, in eternity for any problems that arose from the software. And the collective group decided, obviously, not to sign this document. Instead, what we did was we worked out an agreement collaboratively with the Campaign Finance Board's legal staff to open source the software. That by putting it in an open source repository, this would create a neutral territory where we could contribute this into the public domain, and the Campaign Finance Board would be able to take down the license to that. At the same time, an organization in California called OSET created a special open source license called the OSET Public License. This license specifically addresses some of the shortcomings in other open source licenses that prevent government from easily adopting open source code. And we are pursuing open sourcing this now using the OSET Public License. This will be open source in the next month or two. We have, as a result, also interest from many municipalities around the country to adopt this. The Campaign Finance Board is going to then be able to issue additional RFPs in a formal process to build upon and expand on the code that this pro bono group did for free, but using pair programming, test-driven development, agile development processes, and fully integrated into private APIs that the CFB stood up for the data that supports candidate information, as well as the back-end integration with the KIFIS system, which manages all the campaign issues that candidates are required to report into. So there's an example of how it can be done. It's very difficult to scale that as a process, but there are literally hundreds of managers around the country, around the city, who have specific projects where they need help. And the questions that you need to ask yourself, have to do with, do you have the sophistication to be able to navigate this sort of government, corporate, and legal environment to make something that really works? And then do you have a technology group that understands the respects to kind of the enterprise and legacy technology environment that these, agencies operate in, so that you can speak the same language and give them assurance that this is actually going to work in a way that's compatible with their existing environment. So anyway, I hope that helps.
Other question, I have to say that's fascinating, because I knew the story of the apps up to the fact that it existed, but I didn't know this licensing issue, IP problem. Fascinating. I have questions, but do others have questions? Yes.
What's the capacity, I guess this might be a general city council question. What's the capacity of the city council or like your legislative process to compel a government agency to perform some type of, to implement a specific process or perform some type of activity? For example, having, the Office of Emergency Management release or like manage a set of data about like facilities or to accept requests for aid or something like that. Like, is that something that could be addressed through the legislative process?
Well, I mean, I can answer that under open data law, there are deadlines by which the agency has to say why they're not releasing a database.
Or like
releasing-
compelling them to build such a database?
Well, building would either be legislative, or you would work through the mayor's office of operations, to be honest with you. In other words, if there was something that came out of Sandy, or came out of Occupy, or came out of a beach erosion crisis, whatever. Sometimes it's just hard to find, sometimes these databases exist, and even the Office of Operations doesn't know about them. That was what was interesting about our open data bill. Not only is the public interested, but the mayor's office was, ooh, I didn't know they had all those databases. So, but I mean, I think that either legislative or legislative would be a new database. Yes, you can do that. When we did crash data, when we mandated that, I had a bill that says we have to know how many trucks and cars, I'm making it simplistic, are coming into the 5 boroughs by a certain date. That is a database.
I think that one of the tenets behind OpenFOIL is one strike and you're in, which is this concept that so many of the different data sets are out there, and sometimes you figure out they might exist. And so the idea behind it is to help expand and support the landmark open data bill by making sure that when somebody foils a specific data set and that it's created, that it's one strike and you're in. So now that data set would hopefully live in the open data repository moving forward. Andrew Hunt.
Really glad to hear all
You
this.
can pop up if you want.
Sure.
Another scary person who knows too much. Andrew.
I'm really glad to hear all this attention being paid to software, not just data, because data is foundational, but so too is software. And it's definitely more wonky. It's more difficult to go through the litany of issues that the council member and Art have described, let alone to resolve them, let alone for a single project like NYC Votes, let alone to resolve them systemically for government, so that it becomes the rule, not the exception, that software gets developed and maintained, contributed, and shared in the ways that both Art and the council have outlined. But I really believe that that's where the future of government innovation lies, is not just in getting data outside of government so we can do great things with it, but changing the enterprise information management, creation, and sharing tools that are the way that government works. So I think a combination of your legislation, the kind of legal and technological software development methodology sophistication that Art outlined, and the transparency around the money that goes along with all this on the controller side, are 3 key ingredients to having New York City become the gold standard for how that's done. And I really think there are hundreds of millions of dollars to be saved, but also more importantly, the ability to actually innovate in the workflows of government and make it work better, much faster therein. The one missing, or not necessarily missing, but next piece that I would love to also see is something that at NASA we call the Pursuits Registry. And that is basically an early warning radar about what is coming down the pike that one agency needs, or that ideally 3 or 4 or 5, maybe 10 agencies need, in a way that's systematized, so that you can start to have data out ahead of when you're going to issue an RFP, out of ahead of when you're going to buy something, certainly that can help you aggregate that effort.
What's an example of that?
So if you needed to build people for something, an e-commerce system, there's something like 40 city entities, I believe, that charge people for things. And doing that not only in a way that adheres to the same common data standards, which is very important, but also potentially investing in building a single, or bringing in a single, ideally open source set of tools, so that those 40 agencies can use the same thing and aggregate their budget and frankly their creative energy to making that common set of tools as good as possible would not only save money but also result in a better tool. And then if you take it to the scale that Ben was talking about, where other governments in other cities that have a very analogous need to charge people for stuff, we're aggregating that effort in turn. You outstrip quickly the scale of even what Microsoft or an IBM can develop with tens of thousands of engineers. So I think that's really exciting. 18F at the federal level, the sort of startup within the government for technology development, is apparently just about to announce an open source first policy as well. So New York City will be in good company, and I just couldn't be more excited. We were really distressed when the technophilic and incredibly savvy council member in the form of Gail Brewer left, and I was, it was like a dream to have that be carried forward and now taken to the next level by you, Ben. So we're big fans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please take a look at the Civic Commons legislation, Andrew, and there should be something there along those lines, but if it's not as bulky and it's not doing what it's supposed to, please give us some language over the GitHub or whichever way you wish to comment.
Comment right here, go ahead.
This is actually a question for Art. I founded a website and it launched last year called Voters Friend for NYC vote primary in general. Very similar to NYC Votes. Put in your address and see your ballot and learn about candidates. And I remember looking at NYC Votes and thinking how awesome it was that government was innovating along a similar line. I was really impressed. But I was wondering, one of the things I learned is that elections are so local and very specific to localities. Is NYC Votes applicable to other localities, and can it be sort of spread, across the country, or is it very specific to NYC?
I'll stand up because my voice is going. So in its simplest form, NYC Votes is a geotag database of candidates that has a search functionality which is organized by the geotags related to the precinct boundaries for each election district. And because it's a very generic tool in that respect, that when it's open sourced, it will be able to be used by any municipality or civic group or candidate or really anybody who's willing to abide by the OSET public license. So you would be able to use that, and others would be able to use it. And the questions that come up are, where's the data going to come from? So this year for the fall election, because very few city candidates are running, if any, special elections that I still may not know about. But
they're all doing it either in June or September. There's no specials so far.
right, so it'll all be state and federal, and as a result, virtually all that data is going to be available via the Voter Information Project. And so we are going to be tying in our app to the data source in the VIP to enable, for New York City. Now, an interesting thing is that New York City is going to have its next citywide elections in 2017, and so there are candidates who are going to be running for office then, and so we're in the process actually of taking our credit card processing tool and then enabling it as a web widget as well for candidates like candidates to freely use, which will really assure a lot easier compliance with the rules. But we see this thing as a living project. One of the problems, and I'll make this as a note, is that elections happen at the most generally yearly. There's some exceptions, but yearly biannually. But when you think about local and government, the fact is that you want to be able to say, well, okay, it's one thing to go vote, and then through our app you can find out who won. But the next step is, how do you engage with your elected official, your representative? How do you communicate with them? How do you keep tabs on what your local officials are actually doing? How do you actually see what's happening in the community board in your neighborhood, so that the tool, which right now is very superficial at best, becomes much deeper and starts to get at much more of the things that really matter to people in their day-to-day lives. And so then one of the things that we're thinking about is what happens with this tool as you go forward. And what's the right role of the CFB with this tool, given the fact that we have to be nonpartisan? We're not bipartisan, we are nonpartisan. We can't show favor to any side on any issue about anything as long as it complies with the law.
I just want to add, the CFB has been so phenomenal, not just VAC, but also CFB, because we passed a law that says you can text in a contribution of under $100. And they're working on that to make it comply with CFB rules, and at the same time, figuring out how it happens. And it wouldn't have happened without the CFB saying we can go forward with it. So the CFB is very much ahead, I think, much thanks to Art and to the staff there of other city agencies. They really are.
I think that a lot of the legislation in this package is aimed at providing the community with the data that you need so that you can make that next app, that government, not 2.0, but actually 3.0, where you actually have a location of their app, where you're able to take a picture of something or press a button and say, I have a problem, and then that app is able to actually connect you with the elected official for that area. If our phones are location aware, why isn't our government?
Although I do get enough information from all of you to sink a ship, just so you know.
And Gail is available on Saturdays to do
Oh my God,
individual
boy, I get a lot of
constituent service.
I do, but it's a lot.
Any other questions?
You must have other questions. Good, go ahead.
When it comes to getting things passed in city council, like what do you guys need? Like how could that be facilitated? Like do you have like a caucus or something? Like do you have, like does it make sense for people like us to go and talk to our city council people and be like, hey, like this is what's happening, like you guys need to get behind these folks? Do you have a name, do you have a brand for this?
I mean, the answer is yes. When we started out the technology committee years ago, there were posses, and they're in this room, to be honest with you. There were like 10 posses. But the technology world has expanded. Obviously, Rashay, PD, the work that all of you have done, Andrew, Cole, and so many others. The issue is, yes, we would look to see who's on these bills in addition to the council member. And when your council member is not on, that's when you try to get him or her on. But if they are on, you also thank them. To be honest with you, picking up on what Andrew said, people have no clue what any of these bills are except for about 5 members of the city council. So they need to hear from you that it makes sense. That when you talk housing, social services, they understand. Technology is a blank. Still, 2014. So helping Ben with this information being the right thing to do, in this case, yes, because there's no constituency for technology. It's a very small constituency. If you're doing the education piece, you got parents. If you've got a housing piece, you've got tenants. You get the picture. Technology is there's no demand side. That's my experience. So we're the demand side. It's very small. So the answer to the question is, on this topic, you are very needed.
So to just echo the borough president, who's been doing the council stuff and getting a lot more passed than most of her colleagues ever did in the council. It does come down to the communities and demonstrating that there is a community. So it means paying attention to the hearing schedule and making sure that when you see the bills that matter to you, that you come out for the hearings and you demand the changes in the legislation that you want to see there. It means joining some of the organizations that are at the forefront of this. It means when you read about legislation you like, figuring out who your elected official is and lobbying the council member, lobbying your borough president, lobbying your public advocate, lobbying the mayor, and forgive me for saying lobby, you don't actually have to spend money on this, you can advocate, and that's really what I meant there. The other thing is encourage them to get on a platform called AskThem.io and make sure to ask that question in a public forum. We're hoping to get a lot more online commenting. You can send emails, you can organize people. Organizing is a great way to get things done. But part of the reason I wanted to bring this legislation to you is sometimes things get passed because people don't know or because the right deals are made, but it works a lot better when there's a transparent process and when there is a constituency demanding something. The Open FOIL City Records Online got introduced last week. Open FOIL got introduced, I think, last month. and they're already coming to hearing, which is a breakneck speed when it comes to legislation, which is usually the slowest way to do anything after procurement. Yes, please help out. We need your help to get these laws passed.
Quick thought, just you mentioned the hearing on Monday, and you mentioned that you need help with some of the bills. Putting Noel on the spot, is there a way to just make sure that whenever anything's happening that the community needs to know about, getting word out through Beta NYC?
Is that a question to me?
Noel, hop on up. You get emails.
A request, not a question.
Noel gets emails
And
from Gail and I probably on a daily basis.
Just so the microphone. Thanks for asking that question. I respectfully decline to answer now. I was talking to a few people. The council has a few different methods of communicating and notification. One of them is to send kind of like this mass email to you about, I guess, a mass email to an individual about a subject matter that a council member finds interesting that we should pay attention to. And there's no clear way for a citizen to actually subscribe to those type of notifications, even within the internal system. So my Code for America email address gets bombarded with IT things. Well, there was going to be a hearing on reforming 911, and I'm just like, what the heck is this all about? I will try to do a better process of building infrastructure within Beta NYC to do community notifications. Over the next 6 months, I really want to put inside of our community kind of either working groups or communications groups that can be more distributive and engage with the community, or and also engage with elected officials, so that way there's a proper bi-directional pipeline, so that way there's not a bottleneck of myself or any one of my email accounts that's registered with the council. So yeah, you should help spearhead that, Rich. We'd love to have you work on that. Yeah,
And actually, it's something that either of your offices, when you're getting word out, to just make sure you send it to the meetup group, then it'll go to a...
We definitely do. Two additional things. One, part of open legislation, part of an open API, is you should be able to type into our legislative information system, whether it's hosted by us or Councilmatic or Madison, that if it has technology or open source or XYZ in this, that there's an alert, just like a Google alert on legislation, and when the bill moves or something that you're following moves, you get a notification alert, and when there's a hearing, you get that, because literally that's how the rest of your life works. I also want to say one other important thing. We have members of the media here, and they're the fourth estate, and they're actually perhaps one of the most important players in this, because they are a check on government. They are the fourth branch, ostensibly, and without their coverage of the things that we're doing, nobody knows about it. So the other thing is, when you see something cool that you like, they now generate revenue through clicks. So the more clicks you get them, the more likely they are to cover issues that people outside this conference may not think are as important as we do.
I'm still a big believer in regular old email, at least for my list. So I have 400,000 people on my email list, and that works, because then when people get it, that's how they know. I mean, everything else is fine. Put it up on the website, you give them a Google alert. They don't pay, at least my group doesn't pay attention. But if when they get an email, that works, for me anyway.
One other...
Can I also just quickly respond? So some of the advocacy that we did, should I put up here? This is Okay. Some of the advocacy that we did with the help of Ben Kalos and Brad Landers is that the speaker, in rules reform, the speaker has agreed to a public technology roadmap or report. And the testimony that we read as Beta NYC into the community was the fact that we want to see, just in the same way that the New York City NYC Digital did roadmap and listening sessions in the different boroughs, is that we want to see the Speaker's Office do similar outreach to different types of communities. You know, particularly going to community boards, going into the different tech communities. You know, we have in the different, there are 5 different tech, New York City tech meetups that almost pertain to every single borough. Go and engage with them to understand what are the needs from the community, so that way that can be built into a broader technology package that the council can then eventually resource and develop. But they have to hear from us, And it's in rules reform. So you could call the speaker's office and demand the fact that you want a listening session, and that would be one step to ensure that we have a larger conversation around notifications and communications infrastructure.
I just want to add in Manhattan, at least in terms of the 12 community boards, I think Rich knows this, but we are going to make every single one of those, we'll be announcing it during the summer, extremely tech savvy, lots of support, and so that will be coming.
Which is my second comment of just commending you for especially getting the tech interns for the community boards. It's so desperately
There'll be
needed.
more.
So fabulous news.
So I was on Community Board 9 up West Harlem for 2 years. I run a technology innovation center. What I found was that, so the very first step of getting the word out about various things that are happening is ad hoc at best, right? So I'm glad to hear you say that, and I'm wondering what the actual, what the support is when the
We'll be
community.
announcing it. We're
Okay.
working on it now.
Because the board itself is not very tech savvy, so even.
None of the boards are ever going to be, in the next decade or two, extremely tech savvy, but we will help them. You're always going to have older New Yorkers who
Sure.
are on them. No, I
Sure.
mean, there's a lot of older New Yorkers on the board, because that's who shows up.
Yeah.
And stays on for 35 or 40 years,
Yeah,
to be honest
yeah.
with you. And that's what it takes to make a difference in this city. So
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in long-term, but we'll work on it. I know your board very well.
Okay. One possibility is those digital signage, if we could do that up there. I'm at 154th Street. A lot of our neighbors aren't tech savvy either, so emails don't work for them. They want people to come and say hello or flyers. But if some subway stations down here will have billboards, maybe that could help.
Just help, that's a good
Yeah.
idea.
One of the things that I noticed, a lot of the people in this room are obviously really excited about this, and so are you guys. But when I go to ask other council members, about these things, like stairs, have
We know.
no idea
We know.
what I'm talking about. What do you think is a way to bridge that gap? Like, how do we bring those people who are going to be responsible for voting on some of these bills and get them excited about that and help them understand in a way that's not going to be over their head?
You go and then I'll go.
The quick answer is show them the apps. When we talk about free and open source and software freedom and licensing, unless you're a hardcore nerd, that's really gonna glaze over. But when you show somebody something like Open Congress, which is something that David Moore helped build, and is now with Sunlight Foundation, you say, hey, we could have that website. Or you point at nysenate.gov, and I show another council member, look at what the nysenate.gov website that Andrew and Noel and their team put together looks like and how amazing it is, and look at all the different features and content types they can put. Council members get really excited about having a method of communicating. And when you say, listen, we're currently stuck in this awful contract with Lockheed Martin around a proprietary code base where we can't make any changes to it, but hey, we can take this code base that the Senate already paid for, we can pay one of our in-house developers for a couple of hours of their work to set it up, and then we can build it, and whatever we build and whatever features we add, the Senate can use. My honest dream is, and I know that our public advocate shares this dream, is for the Senate, the Assembly, the City Council, and all of us to share the same free and open source code base, for us to all be using Drupal as a content management system, and for us to be using a CRM, a client relationship management tool. I'm actually hoping that we'll use Civi CRM. I have a preference for that, but I know that there's also a Drupal version of it. But the idea is 90% of our jobs isn't getting to speak at conferences or doing legislation. It's actually constituent service. I spent 2 hours this morning in person meeting with dozens and dozens of members of my community, talking about stoplights, about affordable housing, about construction noise, about dust, concerns about asbestos from a building across the street, and more affordable housing. And most people shop, so somebody's not just going to call me. They're going to call me, they're going to call their assembly person, they're going to call their senator, they're going to call Gail Brewer, they're going to call all of us, and all of us are going to be working on the same thing. But if we actually had a centralized constituent management system, we could actually share casework between each other. And we could also create a centralized infrastructure because, believe it or not, when you have a problem with your Macintosh, well, maybe not Macintosh, but with your Dell, you're getting connected to somebody in another country. That person doesn't even own a Dell, and they have the instructions they need to provide you with the services they need, and they have the technology infrastructure that allows them to, no matter who picks up the phone, work on the same ticket, work on the same problem, and get you to a resolution. And if the private sector has been doing this for so very long, I don't know why the city can't.
I mean, I think that I'm a little bit less sanguine about it. I do think that you will have more buy-in if somebody from your neighborhood, teachers, technologists in Brooklyn or Queens or wherever you're from, have an interest and bring it to your attention. And then, of course, if you can show that the constituents are helped more, the constituents are political. And yes, it would be good, just like an electronic health record, which is another whole discussion, to have something so that that one individual is helped by different people. I must admit, I am, as Ben is, work really hard on constituents. Not all my colleagues do. So I'm not so sure, I don't know if that's gonna work. I mean, I'm not willing necessarily to advocate in the same way. I always advocate harder, so I'm not sure that I wanna work with, I'm being honest with you, other colleagues. So, because they don't do the same kind of work I do to make sure that woman doesn't get evicted. Ben does, but a lot of them don't. And so, you have to, this is an ongoing discussion. The technology is there and should be used if one wants to, in maybe selective cases. But in terms of getting people interested in this topic, which is also what your question was, that takes one-to-one, people like you talking to your council members.
Hi, my name is Jenny Feinberg. I have a few suggestions on top of what you guys just mentioned. I've been working to elect local officials across the country for the past 6 years, and I guess the three things I would offer, one is you have to bring it home, so you have to do what's familiar to people. So, in all due respect, when you mentioned Drupal and CRMs to a lot of elected officials, they're like, I don't know what that is, and they don't even want to touch it. They barely want to touch their computer. So when I work with a lot of elected officials, the first thing I do is I Google their names and I show them what their SEO looks like. And I'm like, listen, you don't have a web presence at all. Like, you really need to own the presence that's on the internet about you, even if it's a basic professional photo and a biography. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I often bring them to Facebook. I'm like, okay, so why is it that you're comfortable using Facebook? Many of these elected officials, they're not doing anything, but they have a basic Facebook presence. And I try to show them that there are tools out there, I'm actually working on one right now, that would be as easy to use as Facebook. You can just upload a photo and copy paste in some text, and that would inform your constituents what you're up to. That would give them more information about who you are. And then the third thing is showing them how much more money elected officials make when they raise money online, and that it's usually twice as much, and that these officials think if they do traditional fundraisers and just have people bring in checks at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday night, then that's the best way to raise money. But that's when people have to take their kids to soccer practice and ballet class. And if you raise money online and just make yourself more accessible, you'll raise twice as much. So I'm actually with a bunch of people here. We all work on democracy.com, and we replicated the Facebook template to make it really easy for elected officials to get online, to launch their campaign, and even if they're not active candidates, they can still have a web presence as an incumbent. So that's kind of what I've learned just being on the road and working with officials.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Dan Knowlton. I'm the Deputy CTO at Granicus, and we actually power your legislation portal. So you mentioned quite a number of things about sort of the vendor, and I guess I'm the official sort of representative of the vendor.
Can we please have an open API?
So I'm going to address two questions. The first is
This is
easy
going
one.
to be live cast. So.
I'm totally okay with that. So we actually have the ability for notifications by keyword, RSS, and various other feeds currently available to all clients at Granicus that use Legistar and Insight. New York asked us to turn it off over 10 years ago. We can turn it on in 5 seconds, and everyone here will have access to that, and many other cities already use that. We just need the clerk of NYC to ask for that, and we'd be happy to do that. So that's something that I just found out from our team. Didn't know that we didn't offer that here. We can do it. The user interface was built in 1999. We are working on updating it. That is coming out. One of the big things around the New York implementation is that you all bought from us in the late 90s. So when you bought from us, we built with the technology that was available to us in the late 90s, and the software is installed behind your firewalls. So what that makes it hard for us to be able to do is actually just update you to the latest version. We have open APIs, we have that available. If you want an API key, we can give that to you for all of our other cities, but for New York, you're specifically behind the firewall. And what we've been working on doing is figuring out how we can upgrade you all to get you into the cloud-based application that we have. So this is something we want to work with New York City on. We are not sort of like closed vendor. We want to give your data to your citizens. We just have to work together to figure that out. So I'm Dan at Granicus. Before Granicus, I was the CTO of Code for America. We're very, very open to this, and we want to work with you. So I don't want this to be us versus you. I'd love it for us to be us.
There's intermediary decision makers. How long are you in New York on the East Coast for?
If I need to extend my trip, I can, but I was planning on going tomorrow, so
Come down
this is something that.
Can you come down to City Hall with me and we won't make this happen today?
I'll be happy to go with you, absolutely.
Dan, thank you, and so there's this fun thing. So as elected officials, there's elected official, then there's this government, and kind of a relationship to government is kind of as board members to a large corporation with 350,000 employees and multiple different agencies. So sometimes what ends up happening is between the council member and the vendor can be an entire bureaucracy. And we do want the API. I will tell you, Paul over there is my legislative director. We went through every single bill that had ever been introduced in the city council, and we literally had a team of interns copying and pasting because we couldn't get a Granicus export without having to write a scraper. And it was,
So you all own that data, and it is internal to your IT department. If you wanted that data, you can go in and export it right now. Like your group, your city has direct access to that
what database?
It's a Legistar database. Ask your IT department about it.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. That was very honest and appreciated.
Yes.
Well, so I have two questions. This raises two really good questions. In all of your legislative priorities, I didn't hear cloud. And the second one also, this also implies is, I also haven't heard cloud-based applications. So data stores in the cloud, cloud-based applications, not having things inside the firewall that don't need to be inside the firewall, but putting things out where they're more in the open and easier to access via standard web protocols.
I can just talk a little bit about cloud issues. I think just because we're a long list, but the whole issue of archiving and cloud, I mean, I am a big believer, for instance, in the new director of the municipal archives, and as you know, there are laws that they're supposed to have certain reports. There are hundreds and hundreds of documents that still need to be digitized that are part of the city of New York. I mean, probably warehouses full of documents that should be digitized. What happens to NYC television, as an example? What happens to all of that material is not clear. I've asked this several times. So I think the cloud issue needs a whole hearing and a whole lot more discussion, because it's archiving, it's cloud, and it's just the whole issue of FOIL and emails, to be honest with you, has not been clarified by the city of New York, and not necessarily by any government.
So you should look at, so the Business Integrity Commission,
Yeah, it's a big,
right, recently became the first and only New York City agency to put all of its data stores in the cloud. And so you should look at that.
I know that
that
the
case study.
municipal archives, Pauline Toole is looking at the same thing right now too.
So, quick response. There's a reason for it, at least for me, which is just I don't use the EC3 cloud. I actually did ask at a recent hearing. We have a duplicate system to manage our FISA, which does all of the city payroll. And so we have two systems in case one of them goes down. And I said, oh, why don't we just use a cloud? Because you can literally pay for a server with no computation time on it. And if we ever need to turn on the server, we can turn it on, and then we can put as many resources and as much RAM and processing power behind it, scale it up just for when we need it, and then when we don't need it, we can scale it back down. The quick answer I got was legacy. But that being said, I personally, when I do my stuff, and to the best extent I can tell, also Google, we try to run our own hardware because we tend to get more bang for the buck with our own hardware. versus paying Amazon or a third party to host our systems. And then my office, we're not in the city's infrastructure, because we don't want to get locked behind firewalls, and we like being able to use open source products. So literally, we're hosting my government office off of my own server, and my own server is literally a rack mount rented from a cloud provider, but I put the computer in, I have my jack, and I own my hardware, and my hardware has got RAID and backup and backing up from country to country and things like that that I frankly can't get from the cloud. So I guess I'm agnostic about it, and I haven't brought it up, but it is something I have brought up in hearings.
And I do the same thing. I have a huge database, as I talked about. It's even bigger in terms of, and I keep it separately from the city because I don't want anybody to have it. Andrew?
So there's some really good reasons on the merits that get really sort of wonky about when the host application's on premise for network speed and data jurisdiction and even maybe security issues, and lots of good reasons that drive huge efficiencies putting things in a cloud. Amazon's much better at scaling hardware than anybody in this room will ever be. However, the real thing here around open source and cloud is portability and agility. So if there's no IP friction in the way, you can make that call on the merits anytime, and you can change your mind next year when the answer is different. And the answer will be different next year, technologically or maybe legally, for these questions, right? Similarly, if you have an application hosted anywhere and it's not sort of cloud ready, even if you're choosing to host it in your basement, then you're also limiting your ability to take advantage of the place that's going to be the least cost, highest value for you to host it in the future. So we sort of wrap those concepts together in something we're calling open SaaS, which we think is a big deal for government, open source, but also ready to be delivered as software as a service. And I think that that's an exciting thing for the public sector.
Are you ready to introduce that as a bill yet?
Absolutely. You better than me.
Well, just sure. Two comments. One on, the executive and the legislature. The city council can only tell the mayor to do so much, and this is a very operational thing. Saying you must use cloud services, you must do this, you must do that. And that's not the kind of thing that mayors like a lot for a lot of reasons, because it gets into micromanagement of their territory. So that's so hearings and oversight in something like cloud services or that can draw attention to the issue, but mandating their use seems like a bit of a stretch for any legislature to do. And the second issue is, one of the interesting things about PDF is I think that the tagline is it's the intersection of technology and politics, but that's a bit off, because really this is about technology permeating everything, public policy, politics, governance, and so the idea that technology exists apart and there's a community of technologists that exist apart, I think is a wrong conceit. And my group, in fact, works in a coalition of old line good government groups and groups like Knowles Beta NYC technologists to try to erase this idea of a boundary. So the question was raised, how do I help change the political process? How do I pass legislation? The answer is there's a million ways, and you don't have to be a part. You can take your passion for anything. Say you work with an HIV/AIDS group or a housing group or whatever it is. You can work with that group to help release open data. You can work with that group to help get the Freedom of Information Law work better. You can work with that group to try to get more agile procurement practices. It doesn't have to be an ad hoc thing called Tech First or whatever. Everybody's working on this. So the 100-year-old civic groups in New York City, the guys who've been around forever and wear long beards, they know that this is big stuff. They know that technology is where everything is going. Everybody knows this, and a lot of people are working on it. So this is not an island. You are not a tribe unto yourself. This is a world of people collaborating on these things every day. So any group that's civically or politically engaged has a technology component that you can plug into. So find the fit that works for you, and you don't have to be a part.
The only thing I would add is change.org is great, but don't use it exclusively because there are no addresses on it. So every time I get change.org, I'm like, yep, because there's no address on it, just FYI.
But there was one last thing, which is one of the coolest
if you're here
things.
for change.org, I apologize, but I'm letting you know politically it's great, but it doesn't have an address.
So
I don't care about those people. I don't know who they are.
So Gail Brewer, who is a visionary, is a true visionary nationally, globally in this area.
Absolutely not true.
It is totally true. Passed a bill. She passed a bill 100 years ago or 15 years ago, I can't remember how long ago, called COPIC. which stands for Committee on Public Information C.
Nobody uses, yes,
Okay,
it's a great
anyway.
idea.
Public
But that-
information and
And it was-
communication.
Communication. And that bill was
Rational.
incredibly far ahead of its time. That bill, which passed when? In the 90s sometime?
89.
89,
1989.
that called for city agencies to catalog their data. It was basically the first true open data bill in the entire world. It's called the COPIC bill. Nobody's ever heard of it. It's online. You
Me
can
and
find it.
Jean, the three of us.
COPIC. That bill never happened. It passed the legislature, but mayors didn't want to do it, and it never came to fruition because mayors didn't want to do it. And there was never a constituency around that bill to make it happen. There were not people kicking down the doors saying, you got to do it, you got to do it. And so that was the first open data bill. So open data was not created as a concept 4 years ago or 5 years ago. It had 1989, you can look the bill up, it is an open data bill, period. Now, that I mentioned because I think it's super important. And the reason I mention it is because the bill passed, right? It became the law. It didn't happen, right? There was no stakeholder constituency that kicked enough butt to make it happen. So it's not just passing the law, it's passing the law and staying on it and being part of that stakeholder community, those people who are making it happen. And that's why when important bills come up, you got to fight for them and you got to keep fighting for them. And that's why you got to, when you plug in as a human being, you got to find a place that you like to be. You know, maybe it's Beta NYC because Noel's cool, you know, but maybe not. Maybe it's an affordable housing group. But you got to find something that will sustain your interest, and it's not a one-shot thing. So that's
Why John is a superhero, because he shows up at every one of the follow-up hearings, not just the initial one.
Thanks.
So you're the superhero, not me.
We're actually trying to get COPIC funded. We actually were asking OMB about that today, about if it's in the charter, why don't we fund it, and isn't not funding it a de facto amendment of the charter without the vote of the people. So we are hoping to see it funded and for it to be there to support open data with a
And
budget.
let me just be clear, the public advocate, Bill de Blasio, was there for 4 years. I bugged him for 3 years. He finally had a COPIC meeting. I was on the COPIC meeting, and he had one meeting of COPIC. One meeting of COPIC. I just point that out.
We are hoping that public advocate Tish James will have an annual meeting.
Oh,
and
good.
we'll both hang out there. It'll be
3 years I bugged him about COPIC.
As we're wrapping up in the last 10 minutes, I wanted to give a chance for anyone who had ideas specifically on legislation to give feedback, or does anyone have specific feedback on the legislation?
I mean, publicly, one of the sessions that we had yesterday in a breakout panel around data privacy and data protections. New York City has one of the most forward-thinking human rights laws at a municipal level, ensuring that everybody has an opportunity and it doesn't live in a discriminatory city. There seems to be another opportunity to help pioneer the option, or at least the idea, of enshrining some data privacy, data protection, internet privacy rights in some of this municipal legislation, and set forth an example for other municipalities, kind of like, you know, data human rights or an internet human rights, but kind of in the same way that the city's human rights law existed. You know, there are municipalities that are passing laws about how cameras and other surveillance tools like drones are being used. I think that there's a unique opportunity for the New York City Council and other elected officials to also take that and own it and go from there. So.
I mean, there was some discussion when cameras went into NYCHA and so on and so forth with the New York Civil Liberties regarding how long the data is available, particularly nightclubs. I mean, it's embedded in some of the camera legislation, just so you know, but probably not hooked up to the larger process. But it does come up every time cameras, drones are new. I mean, they weren't surveying us a few years ago. So I think what we should do is look at the legislation that exists and see what's embedded, and then it's a good idea.
Want to do a joint bill on that?
Sure, we'll do a joint bill on that.
Yeah,
Had one
thank
in
you.
council law, we couldn't get it passed.
What, we did.
We had one on the council.
We tried.
Did we ask for the reintro on that yet?
We will, Ben. This is an ongoing discussion. We will. Rich?
From
Like
lofty
it-
human rights to the mundane of procurement, and we had talked a bit before, but passing legislation suggesting that restrictions are kept to a minimum, because some procurement, some RFPs require that you've been in business for a certain number of years, which precludes small startup firms.
I mean, it's not just apropos technology, just. so
Correct.
you know.
Yep.
I think people are looking at that, but we could.
Yep.
It's not just you.
Yeah, and one example is which is not technology, but I was rejected for just getting on a vendor list because I didn't set up my LLC at least 3 years ago. And it's for STEM education, so it's something where you want people who are new to the field and who are more current. But it just had, and they wouldn't bend on that rule.
We have to find out why it's a little more.
You can buy a Shell LLC for nothing too.
Find out why.
3 years ago.
That might be why this is challenged. Yes.
What about any protections, back to what Noel was saying, for like the Apple iBeacons coming out and consumer control over what kind of information they can share, to kind of flip the power that way.
I just don't know how much is city, state, and federal. Right?
Right,
Well-
but there is a huge community out there all over the world about just the fact that if Google is selling my information, shouldn't I have a share of that, or shouldn't I have to share over what information is being shared? Shouldn't there be a meaningful disclosure?
So especially can we do that locally?
Right, so I was just talking to Doc Searles, who's in with the Berkman Center at Harvard, talking about this kind of thing. And it's not just online, it's walking in person around the shops, and when the shops start bombarding you. Something to keep in mind.
Sometimes you can get at things different ways, you know, where you would not be preempted. That would be the, that would be the question. I know just something that not tech, but we had domestic workers whom I've always been supportive of, and we were able to pass local legislation through the Department of Consumer Affairs. So that might be no way to do it, because we're not going to get at it on the larger security / other kinds of national issues.
We have 3 minutes left. Does anyone want to?
Hey, John.
Sure, I might as well grandstand here. Here's a memo of support from 30 groups for the open FOIL legislation. I'll just put it on your quasi-official video record here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much.
So this is one way to help, and thank you so very much for that. So I hope that this becomes an annual tradition. For those of you who are here, please let Andrew and Mika, and thank you to everyone who is organizing, so let's just give them a round of applause. Please let the organizers of Personal Democracy Forum know that you liked the panel if you did, and that you'd like to see it again next year. With a little bit more lead time, I'm hoping to actually bring a city council hearing to Personal Democracy Forum, so that we'll actually be able to engage in the legislative process here, maybe even get to vote on something, but the goal is to actually bring it. Help us figure out, so if there was a lot of conversation, a lot of people in the room are already engaged. Help us figure out how to really engage people. How do we take it to the next level? How do we pull an Art Chang and develop the next app that'll actually get people engaged? And just, this government is yours. We have 3 years, 6 months, and 25 days to do something amazing and disruptive. And next year will be at 2 years, 6 months, and however many days. And just thank you so very much. And Gail?
I want to thank you. I want to just add, with a lot of your help, we are, city agencies, 18 of them are now mandated to do webcasting. And the deadline is coming and going, I think, in March. But they're working on it. Sometimes there's no capacity coming into the building. Sometimes there are costs associated with software, the hardware, and so on. Although we all know you can do it very inexpensively. But it's just another example of where we're trying really hard to open up city government. I have to say there was a fascinating discussion for me from Art and John and Ben and Noel and Andrew and all of you coming up with ideas that we'll try to implement. There's no, it's exciting. You should just know, to answer your question about how we can be involved, this is a changing field, so different every day, every week, every month. So your input is really valuable. I mean, if you were a housing activist, I'd be very polite and say, thank you so much for this information. And then I'd say, I've heard it all before, but not with technology. And so your input is real, and it's really good. It's incredibly helpful. You might think, what do I have to contribute? Answer everything. So please, please, I mean, literally, if you feel compelled, go sit down with whoever your council member is and see if you can educate him or her. They will appreciate it. And you can do the same for borough presidents too. Thank you very much.